Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. Aditya here. Until now, we have seen what is AWS API Gateway and also we have seen an hands-on session on AWS Gateway. Now, we are going to dive deeper into this topic. The next topic, what we are going to discuss is deployment stages. Okay, so when working with the API Gateway, for example, if you are working with API Gateway, making changes doesn't automatically apply them. So, right, if you working on API gateway, for example, you created a stage in API gateway and you made some changes inside the stage, but the thing is, the changes what you have made won't reflect to the end users or clients until and unless you deploy them. Okay, that's where deployment stages come into picture. So, here are the key points to understand. The first point is effective deployment. When we can say our deployment is effective. So if you simply modify the settings in the API gateway, right, that doesn't immediately put those changes into the effect. So when it will put those changes into effect is when you perform a deployment. Okay, so to activate your changes, you must perform a deployment. So without performing a deployment, right, you can't activate your changes. So then only you can say your deployment is effective. Otherwise, simply making some changes in your stage and waiting that will reflect doesn't work. You have to deploy it explicitly. Okay. And definitely this will become a common source of confusion. So sometimes I'm also get confused. So usually when I create a stage, for example, development stage, testing stage, and production stage. And once I created these stages, right, what I will do, I will make some changes in those stages and I forgot to deploy the changes. And I will wonder why these changes are not working. So definitely this deployment stages is common source of confusion. So you need to do this deployment process, right? Can be confusing for some users like me, right? It is essential to recognize that changes need explicit deployment to take effect. So the same point what I have discussed earlier, the same point you have to do explicit deployment and stages. In API gateway, right? Deployment occurs in stages. So you can create as many stages as needed. For example, you can create a development stage, testing stage, and production stage. So each stage will give you different endpoints. Okay, by using these endpoints, right, you can connect to the backend service. But the thing here is, right, you can create as many stages as possible. You have that option. And the one more important point is each stage has its own configuration parameters. So each stage will have its own configuration parameters. What does it mean? For example, you have development stage, you have testing stage, or you have production stage, and you have your databases. For example, for development, you have to use DevDB. For testing, you have to use UATDB or SitDB. And for production, you have to use actual production DB. So in the dev environment, you can configure your DevDB related username, passwords, or credentials or secret keys. Similarly, in the test environment, you can configure your username passwords related to your UAT or SIT databases. And finally, in the production, you can configure your production related username, password, and URLs and credentials. So that's the advantage of using stages. Each stage has its own configuration parameters. Okay, so those will allow you the fine tuning for different environments. So for each environment, you can say it's like isolated thing, right? Each stage, and it will have its own properties, configurations, environmental variables. Okay, so that's the advantage of stages. Now, one more advantage of stages is rollback capability. Definitely. So this is the important feature you have to remember. The API gateway maintains a history of deployments. For example, if you deployed a particular version of your or particular instance of your stage or version of your stage today, and tomorrow you got some other changes and you again deployed the same stage, right? Now you have v2. The previous one is v1 and the current one is v2. Now if you see, or if the users see some issues in v2, for example the users using your endpoint and they are not getting the proper response what they decide, so what you have to do is you have to roll back to your previous version, that is v1. And the rollback capability is possible because the API gateway keeps a history of deployments so that you can go back to the any version at any point of time. Okay, so if you need it, you can roll back to a previous stage configuration, obviously. And in summary, right, API gateway deployment stages provide control, flexibility, and a structured approach to managing your APIs across various environments. Okay, and remember to deploy your changes explicitly to ensure they become active. The same first point. You want to your changes to be active, right? If you want to change your changes to be active, you need to ensure you have to deploy your changes explicitly. Then only they will become active. Okay, I hope you understand about deployment stages and its importance in API gateway. And moving on to the next slide where we have an example here. So in this example, we have a client and this client is interacting, right? This client has an API by using the API gateway. So this is the endpoint, that is V1. So this client using the V1 stays API and able to access the backend Lambda like this. But what happened, right? This backend got corrupted, or you have some other changes. Those changes you are not going to deploy in this backend. You want to create a new backend, right? For that, you can create another stage, that is V2 stage, version 2 stage. Now, the new clients, for example, this client, he is the new client. He can able to access the V2 stage and which is using the latest code. So the previous code is also working now here if you see here, and we have latest code also, and the new clients using the v2 url and the previous clients are using v1 url, right? So you can see, right, you have this backward compatibility also by using these stages. The same thing, the rollback capability. And if the user, the client sees some issues with v2 stage, he can roll back to v1. And if the v1 user, right, continues to use the v1 stage, and in future, right, if he want to migrate, he can switch to v2 stage. Similarly, if you have another client, right, and you have some issues in this backend, or you have changed your backend itself to another lambda function, right, then you can point to that lambda function and you can create a new stage. And all the newer clients, right, they can use this v3 stage. And the v2 and v1 customers or clients still they can consume those stages, and if they want to migrate in future, they can migrate to v3 stage in the future. So that's the advantage of this deployment stages and how this works, right? Each deployment stage is own configurations, so the configuration also isolated from each other. I hope you understand about deployment stages and this example, and I'm moving on to the next slide. So the next slide is about stage variables in API gateway. Okay, so in the API gateway you usually hear this word called stage variables. Okay, so now what are these stage variables? Stage variables serves as environmental variables tailored to specific API gateway stages. Okay, so if you see these stage variables, these are nothing but are equivalent to environmental variables of other services. If you take Lambda, you have environmental variables, right? Why we use environmental variables there? Any often changing configuration, right? Without affecting the deployment process, we use environmental variables. The same purpose here. The stage variables also used as environment variables. That means those are used for configuration only. So if you see this point, they provide a mechanism for managing dynamic configuration values without requiring frequent redeployments. So definitely, right, if you use these environmental variables, right, you can change the environmental variables, but you don't need to redeploy the code. The same applies here also. The stage variable also, we don't need to redeploy our stages, right, because these are like environmental variables, and you can use any often changeable configurations there stored in the stage variables, so that our stages will use those stage variables, right, instead of redeploying every time, every change in our stage variables, right. So that's the advantage of stage variables. And one thing you have to remember, they are similar like environmental variables. Okay, so if you see the common use cases in API Gateway, right, where you can use these stage variables, the first one is dynamic endpoint configuration. So to define a stage specific HTTP endpoints, either for development, testing, and production environments. So you can define the stage specific HTTP endpoints also by using the stage variables. And so it's simple, right? You can use dev to represent dev HTTP endpoint. You can use test to represent testing HTTP endpoint, and similarly, you can use prod to represent the prod environments. Okay, and the Lambda function configuration also. So if you are using Lambda as your backend in your API gateway, then this use case will be useful. So if you see this use case, you can pass configuration parameters to Lambda function through mapping templates. So that means, right, these stage variables could be passed as in configurable parameters to Lambda. So Lambda you can pass from stage to its backend, right? If you use Lambda as its backend, you can pass it to backend as a configurable parameters. And to pass that, you have to use one thing called mapping templates. Okay, so I will show you what is the mapping templates and how it looks. And yeah, you have to use mapping templates. By using these mapping templates, you can able to pass these stage variables as configurable parameters to Lambda function. Okay, and the third use case is context access. Okay, so if I pass this Lambda function or configurable parameters to Lambda, right, how Lambda can able to access it? So it can able to access through its context object. So if you remember, right, Lambda will receive two parameters. One is event, the second one is context. And in the AWS API Gateway, if you are using Lambda as backend, right, and if you define some stage variables, you can pass those stage variables to Lambda, and Lambda can able to access those stage variables through context object. That is the point here. Stage variables are accessible within the Lambda's function context object. Okay, the stage variables are accessible within the Lambda function's context object. Okay, I hope you understand about the common use cases, and I'm moving on to the next slide where we will see how to access the stage variables. To access the stage variables, you need to use this particular syntax, or to reference a stage variable within an AWS API Gateway resource. Let for example mapping template. We have to use the following syntax. Okay, so this is the stage specific. So each stage, the stage variable may change. But yeah, the syntax looks like this. Dollar stage variables dot variable name. So you created a stage variable in your stage, and inside the stage, right, or inside your API gateway, you can use this like this format. Dollar curly bracket and stage variables dot variable name. And moving on to the next point, that is example. So if you see this example, right, to pass stage specific API endpoint to a Lambda. So here what we are doing in this example, we are passing a stage specific API endpoint to a Lambda function. So the JSON could look like this. So if you pass, right, a stage specific, that means you are passing the stage. And if you see here in the lambda, if I write like this, right, hello from stage variables dot stage, no. So this represents, right, the stage which we are passing from API gateway. So you can pass stage as prod, dev, text, v1, v2, v3, anything. So this is how you can reference your stage variables. Okay. So by leveraging stage variables, you can effectively manage and adapt API gateway configurations based on the current deployment environment. If your current deployment environment is dev, you can pass stage variables dot stage as dev. If your current deployment environment is prod, you can pass stage variable dot stage as prod. Okay. Not only stage, you can pass username, password, URLs, whatever configurable values you want to pass here. Okay. So that's about the stage variables, and we covered stages and also stage variables. Okay, I hope you understand this. Now we're going to see how the stage variables, right, will be used in real world scenario or real world example. So for that example, we'll see leveraging stage variables for Lambda alias based invocation. So here we are using Lambda, right? But we are using Lambda aliases. And I hope you remember what is Lambda aliases, right? For a single Lambda function, you create multiple versions, right? And each version can be tagged with alias. And each alias can reference two versions based on the weight, right? The traffic can be routed. Okay, I hope you remember that. But aliases will be used for the same lambda. So same lambda should have multiple aliases, right? For example, prod alias, dev alias, test alias. And these alias should point to different versions of the same lambda. So that is the lambda alias. And if you want to learn about lambda alias, or if you don't know about lambda alias, or if you're not following my course from the beginning, right? I have a video where I explained about lambda aliases in depth. You can go and watch. Okay. Now, right? By associating a stage variable with a specific lambda alias. So that means, right, we use a stage variable which represents a specific lambda alias. Then API gateway can intelligently route incoming requests to the appropriate function version. So here in our API gateway we are mentioning the lambdas alias through stage variable. So the stage variable is a configurable parameter, right? So that for each stage you can change that. So for example, dev, you specify dev lambda alias, then API gateway will intelligently route all the requests to the appropriate dev function version. That may be version latest. Okay. Or in case of fraud, that may be version v1. And in case of testing, that may be version v2. So leveraging stage variable with lambda aliases, you can achieve that. This dynamic routing mechanism eliminates the need for manual configuration changes whenever lambda functions are updated or deployed. Definitely, right? That is the use of lambda aliases. So we know why we use lambda aliases. Underlying versions may change, but alias will remain same thing, right? So that the source or the service which connecting to lambda alias no need to update it code, right, to point to the new version. Simply the lambda code will change to point to the new lambda alias to point to the new version. For example, you created v1, v2, v3, and you want to point your lambda alias to v3, you can point, or v2 you can point, or v1 you can point, right? That is the advantage of lambda aliases. And if using stage variables in API gateway, you can use this advantage in both API gateway and also lambda function. Okay, and see the key benefits here. Simplified deployment. So you can streamline the deployment process by automating function version selection based on the stage variables. So here you are automating the function version selection. So how you are automating? By using stage variables. So for each stage, for example, prod stage, you will pass prod alias. Dev stage, you will pass dev lambda alias, and test stage, you will pass test lambda alias. And each stage will connect to different version of the same lambda, right? Because alias will point to different versions. And second one is the enhanced flexibility. So you can easily manage different environments, right? Since, for example, dev, test, and prod, by associating distant stage variables with corresponding lambda aliases. For each stage variables, right? For example, dev, text, and prod, the similar example what I said, right? Similarly, you can use a stage variable, for example, lambda alias, but each stage you are passing different value, right? So that it will route to the different versions of the same lambda function, but it will route to the different versions. So that the flexibility is there, right? You are adding that flexibility by using stage variables. And the third one is increased or improved reliability. So definitely we are reliable, right? So we can ensure that API requests are always correctly routed to the function version. So whatever the function version we are expected to route, always, right? This API request will route to that function version because we are passing proper aliases and each alias is point to the proper version. And so that we can minimize the risk of errors or unexpected behavior. So these are the three key benefits you can remember, right? Simplified deployment, enhanced flexibility, and also improved reliability. And if you see the example, right? For example, you have a stage variable called lambda aliases. And the stage configuration, if you observe, development stage and production stage. As I said, we can create n number of stages. Here we have two stages. And here in the development stage, I set lambda alias as dev. And in the production set, I set lambda alias as prod. And here the lambda alias is a stage variable, right? So that what will happen, right? In the development stage, if you hit the URL, it will go to dev alias in lambda. So in the lambda, right, dev alias will corresponding to some version, and that version related code will be executed and you will get back to the response. Similarly, the production also. Okay. So for better clarity, I will show you this flow diagram. And if you observe this flow diagram, you will get better clarity. Okay. So look at the first one here. We have the API gateway, which is having the lambda backend. Okay. And here in the stage variable, we mentioned it says dev alias. It has to use dev alias. So this lambda backend in turn calls one more lambda function and it calling its latest version, that is dollar $latest, because it is dev alias. And here we are saying can route or we can route requests from this backend to this latest code 100%. So all the requests will go to the this backend. And similarly, you will have API gateway here, right? For the test alias. And for the test alias, if you store this test alias in your stage variable, right? And if you pass to the backend lambda function, and this lambda is in turn calling this lambda function, which is nothing but the same lambda function, but version is 2. So this is the newer code which is fixed and they are testing. And here also we are saying we can use this version 100% for this particular alias. So that all the requests will be routed to v2. And in the production, right, the stage variable will be configured as prod alias and the underlying backend lambda again route request to the v1 because prod alias in the is pointing to v1 in this lambda. And right here we do weighted routing. So what is weighted routing, right? We have already seen in our previous lambda alias session. So what here happened is 80% of the requests will go to the v1 and 5% requests will go to the v2. So this is somewhat like canary deployments. So here, right, if you are good, right, for example, this 5% will be executed properly. You can route few more requests to the v2. And if you find everything is working fine, you can directly point the prod alias to v2 also. But here the main intention is we are leveraging the stage variables for lambda alias based invocation. So here the stage, for example, prod stage I am passing prod alias, which is pointing to v1 80% and v2 5%. Similarly, in the test stage, right, I am passing test alias so that this lambda is routing request to the v2. And since In the Lambda configuration, we configured it as 100%, right? Test alias request everything is going to the V2 version. And similarly, dev alias. So like this, by using the stage variables or by leveraging the stage variables, right? And also using the Lambda aliases, you can achieve this kind of use case, right? You can efficiently, reliably route your request to the different versions of the same Lambda by using aliases. Welcome to the hands-on session of API Gateway deployment stages. So in this session, we will explore the API Gateway deployment stages and also see the configuration changes. How can we make the configuration changes, or what are the options available for those configuration changes, and also use stage variables to point different Lambda aliases. So without any further ado, we'll dive into the topic. So now, right, I am opening my API Gateway and also I'm opening a Lambda in a new tab. Okay. So in the API Gateway, first thing I need to do is I need to create an API for me. So the previous API what I have created and deleted, so I'm creating a new API. So the API Gateway page, select REST API and click on build. So once you click on the build, you will get this page, that is create REST API page. So in this page, in the API details section, select new API and give your API name. So since we are exploring the stages, right, we'll say my stages API, and no need to provide any description and the region, just click on create API. So our resource, our API got created under the API, we have slash as resource. Now we'll do one thing, we'll create a method for the slash itself. Okay, so I'm creating a method, and for the method we can select the method type. I'm selecting get as my method type, and I'm selecting Lambda as my backend, and also I'm turning on Lambda proxy integration for structured event, right? As we discussed in the previous session. And in the Lambda function, I need to get the Lambda function, but I don't have any Lambda functions as of now. So I need to create a new Lambda function. Okay. So for that, I'm going to the Lambda. So here in the Lambda page, right, I'm going to create a new Lambda function from the scratch and click on this create function, and this page will open other from the scratch and give your Lambda function name. So I'm giving my stage Lambda, and I'm selecting the Python as my runtime and click on create function. So the function is getting created. We'll wait a couple of minutes. Yeah. So the function got created now. My stage Lambda got created, and now, right, we need to create aliases. So to create aliases, right, first we need to create version also. So first we'll try to create versions, and after that we'll create aliases and point version to those aliases. We'll do now. The first one is we'll make some changes to our code. So currently this code is a Python code which is returning a response like status code 200 and also body hello from Lambda. So here, right, I am going to change hello from Lambda to version 1. Okay, I am saying version 1. I am deploying this code, and once the deployment successful, test the code. So for this, I'm going to create a sample test event itself and save it and click on test, and see you are getting response hello from Lambda v1. Okay, we're good now. Now what I'm going to do is I'm imagining this particular version is my production version, working version, right? So I'm going to publish a version for this particular code. So how can I do that, right? You have two options. You can go to here version section, I can undo, or otherwise in the actions tab in the above, you can publish a new version. So I am using this option actions, publish a new version, and the version is getting created on top of latest. So dollar latest is always your mutable code where you can change the code, right? But the version is immutable. Yeah, we have already discussed those stuff in the theory section, but yeah, just leave about it. So I'm creating a new version. I'm publishing a new version from the latest. Okay. So when I click on publish, it is created a version for me. So now we are in a version 1. And if I go to the code here, right, you cannot able to edit as we discussed because this is under version, right? You can't edit. You don't have any edit or deploy option here. You can only test it. Okay, this is done. And going back to my Lambda, and I'm going to change the code here, the latest code here from version 1 to version 2, and I'm going to deploy this. Once the deployment got successful, click on test, and here you can able to see we're getting response like hello from Lambda version 2. Now I'm going to publish this version. So for that, here go to the version section and click on publish new version, and this public new version is getting created on top of $latest, that is the mutable code, right? And click on publish, you get created another version, that is version 2. Okay, and you can go to the code and see you cannot able to edit the code here because it's a version and the version is immutable. Click on test here, and yeah, hello from Lambda version 2. We're good now. Now again go back to the Lambda and made a few changes to the code, right? We'll do one thing. We'll say Lambda dollar latest version. Okay, so this is the current code. I'm going to deploy this. Once the deployment got successful, just test it. Yeah, hello from Lambda latest version. Okay, fine. So we have created two versions, and one version is dollar latest version, that is immutable code. Okay, so you are good with the version creations, right? Now by using these versions, we'll create aliases. For that, go to alias tab, and here you can click on this create alias button. So name your aliases. So I am naming the first alias as dev, and description is an optional thing. I'm leaving it. And the version, you have three options. One is the version 1, version 2, and dollar latest. Dollar latest always points to the mutable code where you can edit, right? So I'm selecting development alias as dollar latest version always. Click on save. So we got created alias dev, right? And if you go to test here and click on test, right, you can able to see here you are able to access latest version because you are in dev alias, and this dev alias is pointing to the version dollar latest. Similarly, go back to your Lambda and go to the aliases section and create a new alias. So name it test and point version 2 as an testing version. So I'm saving this, right? And test version has been created, which will give you the version 2, right? And you can able to see the version where pointing to this alias is version 2. And if I go to the test option and click on test, right, in the execution results, you can able to see I'm getting hello from Lambda version 2 because we pointed the version 2 here for the test alias. Similarly, go back to the Lambda and go to the alias, click on create alias button, and in the name I am going to give prod. For the prod I am using the version 1, right? And I'm clicking on save now, and the prod alias got created. And if you observe this prod alias, which is using version 1 as we configured, and also if you go to the test and click on the test button, you can able to see you are getting a response from version 1, that is prod. So the prod alias is pointing to version 1. So we have created aliases. So to create an alias, definitely you remember you need versions, and version is immutable, right? All the versions are immutable except the latest version. I hope you understand. And if you don't have idea on aliases and versions, go back to my previous videos where I explained about versions and aliases are in depth in a hands-on session. It will be useful for you. Okay, so we are good with Lambda. we're good with the aliases. Now go back to the API gateway. And here in the Lambda function section, now click here and check whether you are able to get any Lambda ARN. And since you have to refresh this, right? That's why it is not coming up. We'll do one thing. We'll go back to the resources again, our API, and again try to create a method. And the method type should be get, and the integration type should be Lambda function. And we are enabling the Lambda proxy integration for the structured response and requests. And in the Lambda function section, I'm going to select this Lambda function which was created earlier. Okay, and if you observe this, my stage Lambda. Now we have to see how to access our stage variables here, right? As we discussed in our theory part, we can able to access the stage variables at any resource in API gateway. So to do that, we need to use some syntax, right? I hope you remember that syntax, that is colon, dollar, curly braces. Inside that you have to mention stage variables dot, right? Here I am going to say lambda alias. So lambda alias is my variable, and here we are using the stage variables to explicitly mention the API gateway. We are using stage variables. Okay, so this is the syntax, and here instead of lambda alias you can have any name. This is optional, but this is mandatory. Dollar curly braces stage variables dot, you can mention any parameter name. Okay, so once I have given this value, right, the same lambda function ARN ending with this dollar stage variables dot lambda alias, you got this particular warning. So we'll see what it is saying. You define your lambda function as stage variable. Okay, run the following AWS CLI command to ensure you have appropriate policy for this function. Replace the stage variable in the function name parameter with the necessary function name. So to get the appropriate policy attached, right, to our lambda version or alias, what we need to do is we need to execute this particular command. So that is what AWS CLI is providing for us. So just copy this command and we need to execute this in an AWS CLI. So for the AWS CLI, we don't have any command prompt like that, but the good thing is AWS is provided this thing called Cloud Shell. So you can able to execute AWS CLI commands by using this Cloud Shell. So I'm clicking on this Cloud Shell. It's opening my terminal here. Okay. So here we have some previously executed commands. So what I'm doing is I'm clearing this. Yeah. So Cloud Shell got open this command for me. So what I will do is I will paste this command whatever given by the AWS console. So before that we need to do small change. So for that go to your notepad and paste the command what was given by the AWS console. Here in the stage variables dot lambda alias, right, you have to provide the actual alias name. So for that just give, so we have three aliases, no? So first I'm giving the dev alias. So once you provided the dev alias, just copy your command and go back to the Cloud Shell and paste. Okay, paste this and click enter. And if you observe, you got this response back. That means this statement is attached to your Lambda version dev. Similarly, we'll do for the other versions also, for test also. Just change it to test and copy it and go, sorry, copy it and go back to the Cloud Shell and paste your CLI command. Paste. So we are doing it for test. Click enter. And one more statement attached to the Lambda version or Lambda alias, that is test. Similarly for the prod also. So here add your prod and copy the permission command and paste it in your CLI or Cloud Shell. Paste it and click on enter, and a statement will be attached to your Lambda function alias. Okay, I hope you understand, right? Why we are doing. We need necessary permissions, and those permissions are missing, so that AWS CLI itself given this command to you. And here the only one change what we did is, instead of using this thing, we have provided the actual stage variable. That is what it is saying, right? Replace the stage variable in the function name parameter. So you have to give the proper stage value. So lambda alias is for dev is dev, prod is prod, and test is test. So I have given those values. Now, right, we'll see how these executions affect our lambda function. So what it happened in the lambda functions when we executed this, and what permissions added there, and way to check, right? So for that, go back to your lambda function. The lambda function, right? Since we are executed this permission command on aliases, we have to check the aliases whether it got added any new permissions. So we'll go to the dev, right? In the dev alias, go to the configuration section, and in the configuration section, right, if you see we have a role, and if I scroll down, we have resource based policy, and one policy statement got attached here, that is API Gateway AWS.com, which can able to invoke this particular alias. Okay, so this got attached here. Similarly, if you go back and go to the prod alias and go to the configuration and see, right, you have one resource based policy statement attached here, that is from the API Gateway to invoke the Lambda function. And similarly, go back to your Lambda and go back to the aliases and go to the test, right? And if you see here, another resource based policy got attached to this particular lambda alias, so that API gateway can able to invoke this lambda alias. And we'll go back to our lambda function itself and go to the normal permissions. And if you see here, resource based policy statements, there is nothing attached here, because we have attached those things to aliases, not the actual lambda. So that thing you have to remember. Okay. Now come back to the API gateway and close this cloud shell. And yeah, we have attached or executed this permissions, and finally click on create method here. So once you click on create method, it is creating a method for us. So yeah, so it's created a method like this, get method. And what and all this information we have already discussed in the theory section in our first session about API gateway. So we have set up our resource, right? That is slash, and which is having the backend integration with our lambda, this lambda. Now, right, in order to see in action, what we need to do is we need to deploy the API. And to deploy the API, what we need to do is we need to create a stage. So now the stage is coming into the picture. Okay, we have already seen the stage variables, and now we are seeing the stages. So you have to deploy your API, and while deploying your API, it will definitely ask to create a stage or select an existing stage. So since this is a new API gateway, I'm creating a new stage, and I'm giving the stage name as dev. That is the stage here. Deploy. So in the stages section, right, it's moved from the resource sections to stages section, and we got this invoke URL also, that is dev. Now one thing we need to ensure, right, since we mentioned in the resource the lambda should be referred to an alias, and that alias should use a stage variable, right? And before that we have created a stage. No, we can able to test this stage also. So for that, first we can able to test the resource also. So we have a get method, right? So if you scroll down below, right, you will have an option to test it. Okay, yeah, test it here, right? Method request, integration response, method response, and test. In the test, right, you can able to see you got an option called stage variables, and here itself it is popping up as lambda alias, the same value what we have given in the configuration, right? So there at the end of our lambda function ARN, we just provided this stage variable, and now it is reflecting in the test method section as lambda alias. Fascinating, right? and here I'm giving the value as dev. And if I click on test, right, you can able to get the response hello from Lambda version, latest version. And if I give prod and click on test, right, it will hit the version 1. And similarly, if I give test, it will hit the version 2. So whatever we are expecting, we are getting back. And for deployment, right, we created a stage also already, right? And to test this, right, we have to pass the stage variable for this particular stage. So there we are passing in the test method. But here you have to pass, you have to create a stage variable. But one thing, if you don't pass the stage variable, what will happen, right? We'll see that now. Click copy this and go to the URLs and paste it and see what will happen. Look, you got this error because you are not passing the stage variable. So go back to your API gateway and scroll down. The below you can able to see stage variable section. So here click on edit and add stage variable. Name should be lambda alias and value should be dev because it is dev only, and saving it. And it is getting saved. Now if I try to access this, it will take some time to reflect. We'll wait or we'll close it and go to the API gateway and again copy your invoked URL and look, now we are getting the value, right? It takes some time to reflect, but yeah. So hello from lambda dollar latest version. Look, and similarly we have to create stages for different environments. For example, I will go to the resources and again deploy the API, and instead of choosing the existing stage, I will create a new stage called test deploy. And this new stage again you have to provide your stage variable. Okay, click on edit and add the stage variable, that is your lambda alias, and give test here as a value, save it, and similarly go to resource and deploy API and create a new stage called prod deploy it. And in the same prod stage also you need to add a stage variable. So click on edit here, add stage variable called lambda alias and give value as prod and save it. Now we will see, right, how it will work now. Right, you have created the prod, you have created the test, and I will copy the test URL and go here and paste it, and it is saying it's forbidden. Okay, yeah. So slash prod is from the lambda version 1 and slash test is lambda version 2, and definitely slash dev will point to latest version. Yeah. So like this, right? This was fascinating, right? By using these stage variable, the variable name is same, but each stage has its own configuration, so that we can able to route between different versions of the same lambda. Okay. And the one thing you have to remember, how to fetch or access the stage variable in your API gateway resources by using dollar stage variable starts variable name. Okay. So I hope you understand about how to what is stages and how to deploy our API in stages and why it is important, and also how to access it and how you can access different lambda aliases by using these stage variables, and that is fine. And if I go to stages, right, I have created three stages: dev, prod, and test. If I take dev itself, right, you have so many configuration options here. For example, stage details, logs and tracing, and stage variables, deployment history, documentation history, canary, tags, right? So if these are all configurations. So if I click on edit here, you can able to configure some values. Here, if I click on edit, you can configure the name of your stage, but you can't change it because stage name won't. It's an immutable field here, and you can add some description and you can add some caching, right? If you add some caching, what will happen, right? The request and response time will be quicker because those same similar request responses will be cached and sent back to the clients with low latency. And also you can add default method level caching also, and you can set your throttling, how many rate throttling and rust throttling also, the limit to your API calls, and you can able to configure the firewall and certificate settings also. So if you want to add some WAF or if you want to add some client certificates, you can configure here. Okay. So this is about the stage related configuration. And if I scroll down below, you can able to configure logs and tracing also. If you see here in the logs and tracing page, you can enable the CloudWatch logs at different levels also. You can enable only errors, or you can enable both errors and info logs, and you can enable full request and response logs, and you can able to get the detailed metrics of our API calls and how latency and integration latency and all, and you can able to customize the access logging also, and you can able to enable the X-ray tracing, so you have full capability so that you can see what is happening and how many requests got succeeded, how many failed in a visual representation using the X-ray service in AWS. And that's about this logs and tracing settings. And going back, you will have the stage variables. Here you can create a number of stage variables, and deployment history, as we discussed in the theory section, right? We will have deployment history, and you can roll back to a particular deployment whenever you need it. Look, change activity deployment. And documentation history, if you have some documentation for your APIs, you can store here. And the canary settings, so here you can able to add canary settings. In the future session I will explain about this. And finally tags, so tags are useful for your building and all, but yeah, just forget about it. Yeah, these are all the basic configuration of your stage, and you have seen how to create a stage, how to edit a stage configuration, and also how to use stage variables, and also you created lambda aliases, and you leverage stage variables accessing lambda aliases. Okay, I hope you understand the concept, and if you like my video, like, share and subscribe, and let me know in the comments if you want to learn more stuff like this. Thanks for watching my videos. Bye.